Hi, I'm Josh Smith. I wanted to take my teaching week to talk about a topic that is very important to me, and that is farming in Vermont, specifically dairy farming, and more specifically, the rapid decline of dairy farming in the state in the last 20 years, or 21 years specifically. So to give a little backstory on dairy farming in Vermont and why it had a rapid collapse in the 2000s, through the 70s and 80s, many commodity prices shifted up and down, so there was good times and bad for different commodities, and there was increased shift from local markets to national markets and even global markets. And the problem with the national markets is the federal government set the prices on these, which had some advantages in terms of cost of living for people, but disadvantages in terms of cost and price paid back to farmers. So for instance, when my family started farming in the late 50s, the market was almost specific to the region of New England. Some food was made and shifted around internationally, but for the most part, any milk made on our farm in Plainfield, Vermont was either sold locally or on a train down to Boston where it was sold. This shift in national markets led to farm collapse even in the 80s. From 1987 to 2012, farms that were large with 2,000 plus acres doubled. Farms 200 to 999 acres fell 44%. That was all kinds of farms all across the US. And the reason that there was a shift to the bigger farms that they were able to lobby better, they had larger budgets, and they were selling more so they could sell at a lower price. Farms in the middle collapsed because they couldn't make as much money. Farms below 200 acres were often hobby farms or a side organization for people. They weren't their main source of income. So these farms survive, either very small or very large. Middle farms get squeezed out. So even going further back, in 1935, there's 6.8 million farms in the United States. By 2020, there's 2.02 million farms. And especially from 1970 to 2006, 573,000 dairy farms closed in the U.S. In the 60s and 70s, this left a bit of a gap in Vermont with open land, and the 60s and 70s back to the land movement saw a lot of people move to the U.S. Some were part of, you might call, the hippie movement, and they wanted to live closer to the land. So this started a lot of smaller vegetable farms and communes in Vermont, which was a fundamental shift in culture from the dairy farms that had originally lived there. And as these dairy farms shuttered, a lot of times the land would be divided into smaller plots that would be farmed by other people for vegetables and things. In some ways, you see that happening again today, but more on that a little later. It was Vermont's largest single-decade population increase, which now you have similar circumstances going on, but with a decreasing population. Again, more on that in a minute. For purposes of today, the USDA defines small farms as any farm that takes in less than $350,000 annually before costs. In 1991, small farms accounted for half of all food production. By 2017, this is less than a quarter and less than 10% of total dairy production, which shows that there's a huge shift towards large farms being the bulk of our food. As these farm commodity prices, especially fluid milk is relevant to what I'm talking about, go up and down and especially stay flat over time as costs rise, this is an increased need for off-farm income. In the late 2000s, it was 62%, and I think the number has only gone up. I couldn't find more recent. 62% of farmers need and rely on off-farm income. I know my dad worked full-time and ran the farm full-time. Over time, this doesn't become a tenable life situation for many people, so they shutter by choice, and also many farms simply end up selling what they produce for less than the cost of production. In 2019, fluid milk was sold per 100-pound weight $16. This was down 40% from 6 years prior, and was lower than what some commissions were fighting for price 20 years prior. And yet in those 20 years, costs have gone up tremendously. So many farms of the small variety were selling crops for less than their production costs, which obviously is not a sustainable business model. So this led to the larger farms were able to compete with those prices Small farms absolutely could not. A response to this was the Northeast Interstate Dairy Compact in 1997. This encompassed all the states in New England. They all joined. It was based in Montpelier, Vermont. It started in 1997. What they were fighting for was a $16.94 per hundredweight on the cost of milk. Now, this was intended to leave farmers with more income, give consumers a level price at the store, and help farmers to lobby together in some of these small farms in small states. There was 3 or 4 other states outside of New England that were potentially going to join, but with huge lobbying pressure from larger groups, especially in the Midwest, this was actually shut down by a senatorial vote in 2001. So it was short-lived, and the subsequent farm collapse of the 2000s might have been at least partially prevented by the Northeast Interstate Dairy Compact if it had been allowed to stay. So, as we move into the 2000s, the average farmer in Vermont is getting older. Half of dairy farms in Vermont have closed since 2002. My own family's closed in 2009. Dairy is still about 80% of Vermont's agriculture, and 10% of the total dairy farms close each year. That was down to, in 2017, 694 total farms. So 10% would be about 70 after that, and then subsequently somewhere over 60. So it closes by folds. So there's still farms, but it's a rapid decrease, as you can see, and we may see a point where that collapse happens quicker again, as it has in the past. In Vermont, large farms, 700 plus acres, have doubled since 2011, but this is not a direct replacement for the total number of farms lost in terms of the small dairy farms closing, because Vermont's overall dairy herd has dropped by over 11,000 total cattle. Now, the issues herein are that large farms are sometimes maybe more efficient. They're able to compete on national prices, so they keep farms farming in Vermont. They keep a lot of land that was previously farmed open, but they often travel more because they move equipment longer distances to farm different fields to provide food back to cattle that are housed at one location. And so they travel more, they may be less regulated, they may be less supervised, so their overall environmental impact may be higher than that of a small farm. Over time, you see a loss of culture of family-owned farms and the knowledge base and the traditions that go with this. Small farms are their own unique culture, and so this is a cultural loss as much as it's the loss of specific small family farms. There used to be many family farms through any given area in Vermont, and now you find many towns that don't have any of their original farms still active. And the people who worked those often do not pass that on to their kids because there's simply no farm to farm on. Some of the larger farms are still run, but some of the knowledge base is different. And also, you see a shift in the state's identity because we're very much an agricultural state. When you lose that identity, it may get replaced with something else, but you see a fundamental shift in what Vermont has for agriculture and what it means. If there's fewer animals, there's less demand for crops, so there's less demand to keep land open and to keep land agricultural. There might be a shift into more industrial or more housing, etc., where there used to be farm fields. The decrease of farms lowers job opportunities in rural areas of the United States, especially in Vermont, and it hastens the decline of these rural areas. The FDA and the USDA have tracked the loss of jobs and income local to farms as farms shut down in different areas of the United States. This happens in Vermont and in fact all over the country. There's similar situations for small farms everywhere, but specifically in Vermont, you see a decrease of opportunities and jobs, and also the ripple effect of other businesses that relied on the farm income. Because when you have an active farm, you have other people working there, they get money, they spend it locally. You also have businesses, mechanics, supply shops, all kinds of businesses that feed the farm and its ability to run. when the farm stops running, that business may shift to a larger farm, but a lot of times it doesn't. It simply goes away. And so you end up with a kind of vacuum where there used to be economic opportunity and activity, and now there's none. So, despite the national trends of farms only getting larger, Vermont has a unique trend of Vermont farm size shrinking. And what this is different groups of people, sometimes the same people, has worked the dairy farms that have closed or the larger farms that have closed. The medium size really is what it's amounted to. That 200 to 999 is no longer a small, it's more the medium. The under 200 farms have grown in this time, and organic is up 58%. And what this is a shift of different people in different farming styles, often growing vegetables for kind of a locavore movement, people eating food locally. So growing these different crops on these small subsections of old dairy farms often is what it is. You have agriculture staying open in the state. And I've interviewed some farmers who had these small family dairy farms and saw their collapse. Some of them stayed farming, some of them worked in larger farms. Many of them went to different occupations entirely, sometimes using different aspects of their farming skills, sometimes not. They will tell you, almost to a T, they often have a little bit of perhaps ingrained disdain for someone calling themselves a farmer, farming vegetables part-time on a small section of land. But the organic is good for the environment, and the fact that agriculture is keeping in, even if it is a fundamental agricultural cultural shift, it is still good, and it's good for Vermont, and it's a good, important part of Vermont's identity. So, if we don't want the same conditions to come up for small vegetable farms, or small dairy farms, or organic dairy farms, try eating locally. Unless we want to see the same conditions come across these past farms with the rapid decreases and the Northeast Interstate Dairy Compact fighting for $16.94 per hundred, and later in 2017, farms can only get $16 per hundred if they're lucky, but costs have gone up 40 and 50% for production. And we're seeing half of all dairy farms in Vermont close from 2011 to 2002 to 2020, These fundamental shifts in economic activity and farm size will not be replaced. We won't get the small farms back anytime soon. And a national and global food market is hard for anyone to compete on, and it leads to a lot of the safety issues that we've seen as well. Excuse me, with food being transported from further distances, having issues with chemicals, etc. So, Vermont has changed fundamentally in the last 21 years, and farming especially. We have less than half of the dairy farms that we had. The overall dairy herd is lower, even though we've had a lot of larger farms, the 700 plus acres, rise by a significant amount in that time. They've doubled, but it doesn't equal the same amount of activity. The cultural impacts is that we've lost a huge subsection of culture with Vermont's dairy culture. And these changes matter because it is a fundamental loss of a culture and subcultures within Vermont. They're being replaced, but the replacement is not a direct replacement. All right, well, thank you for listening.